Hospice nurses know something they rarely say out loud. There are deaths that look peaceful. The breathing grows quieter, the face relaxes, the person leaves almost unnoticed, the way someone drifts off to sleep. And there are deaths where a person fights until the very last second, holds on, cannot let go, even when the body is already physically ready to stop. The difference isn't in the diagnosis, not in the morphine dosage, not in age or in how ready the person was by medical standards. The difference is in what was happening in their consciousness in the weeks and months leading up to that moment. Edgar Cayce called this the work of the soul before transition, and he described it not as prayers or religious ritual, as specific inner work, as concrete as training for a marathon. Today, 4 things that, according to Cayce, determine the difference between these two deaths. Not philosophy, not abstraction. Things you can start doing today, and for yourself or for someone you love who may be going through this right now. Let's start with a story that shows what happens when this work was never done. A man, 68 years old, pancreatic cancer. The last 3 weeks of his life were described by his hospice nurse as among the hardest in her 20 years of practice. Not physically, but specifically in terms of what was happening within the person himself. He barely slept. He thrashed. He repeated his daughter's name over and over, a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 14 years after the divorce from her mother. Not calling for her in the sense of simply wanting to see her. He literally couldn't stop, as if he were stuck in one unresolved thought looping over and over. His daughter never came. She learned of his illness too late, by which point he could no longer speak coherently. The nurse described his breathing in the final hours as ragged, his body tense, as if he were physically resisting what was happening. She had worked with hundreds of dying patients and said she had seen dozens of cases like this, where a person clearly cannot let go of something specific, something unfinished. And almost always behind it was the same cause, not fear of death itself, fear of leaving with something incomplete. Cayce spoke about this directly across dozens of his readings, given to people who asked about loved ones or about their own approaching transition. The first and most important lesson, closing what is unfinished. Not abstractly, make peace with everyone. Specifically, is there a person you need to talk to? Is there a word that was never said? Is there a grudge held for years simply because it was inconvenient to let it go? Cayce insisted this wasn't a moral instruction about being a good person. It was literal mechanics. An unresolved connection with another person keeps consciousness bound to the physical world with such force that the body may physically be unable to release its breath, even when it's ready to stop. Now, the opposite story, the one that shows what a prepared transition looks like. A woman, 74 years old, the same diagnostic category, terminal stage cancer. But 6 months before it became clear that little time remained, she began doing something her adult children initially found strange. She started calling people, old friends she hadn't spoken to in decades, her son's ex-wife after the divorce, a neighbor she'd once fallen out with over a fence between their properties. Not for dramatic apologies, just short conversations, sometimes literally 5 minutes. I just wanted to say that I loved you, and that everything is all right between us. Her son recalled that in the final weeks of her life, the house was remarkably quiet and calm. Not an oppressive silence, but the kind of quiet that comes when things are settled and there's nothing left to worry about. She died in her sleep, her breathing simply growing quieter and quieter over a few hours, without a single sign of resistance. The nurse who cared for her in that final week told her son what, according to Cayce, is the clearest sign of a completed transition. She looks like she simply closed the book on the last page, not in the middle of a chapter. The second lesson from Cayce, and this is where things get rarely discussed, is the work of facing fear. Not the fear of death itself, but the fear accumulated over an entire lifetime that a person never spoke aloud. Cayce described an exercise that sounds almost like a modern psychotherapy technique, even though he gave these readings nearly 100 years ago. Name out loud, to yourself or to someone you trust, 3 things you fear most about death. Not general phrases like, I'm afraid of the unknown. Specifically, I'm afraid it will hurt. I'm afraid I'll be forgotten. I'm afraid I never managed to do something important with my life. Cayce maintained that fear, named out loud and faced directly, loses most of its destructive power because it is precisely the unspoken, suppressed fear that creates the internal tension which physically manifests as that very struggle in the final hours that hospice nurses witness. The third lesson, what Cayce called energetic debt, and here he had a very specific formulation that differs from the usual talk about forgiveness. He said that every unforgiven grudge, whether it's your grudge against someone or someone's grudge against you, is a literal bond that keeps consciousness tied to the earthly plane. An important detail almost nobody mentions: forgiveness must go in both directions. Forgiving others is only half the work. Cayce insisted that it is just as important, and often even harder, to forgive yourself for mistakes, for things you didn't do, for not being the parent, the spouse, the person you wanted to be in certain moments of your life. He said it is precisely the failure to forgive yourself, not others, that most often turns out to be the very invisible weight that keeps a person in their final weeks in a state of anxious, restless waiting instead of peace. And here is the fourth lesson, the one that genuinely surprises most people when they hear it for the first time. Cayce said that the consciousness of a person in a coma, in deep sedation, or in the final hours before death when they outwardly appear unresponsive, continues to perceive what's happening around them, often with greater clarity than when the body was fully functional. He insisted that relatives should keep speaking to the dying person out loud, even if doctors say they're unconscious, even with no visible reaction at all. Not for drama, because, according to Cayce, it is precisely in these final hours that words spoken with love carry the greatest power. They become exactly that permission to leave, which many dying people, by his observation, are literally waiting for from those they love, before allowing themselves to let go. The nurse from the story we mentioned at the beginning described a case that confirms exactly this. An elderly woman who for several days had shown no response to anything around her lay in a comatose state. Her daughter, following advice along these very lines, sat beside her and said quietly, "Mum, I'm going to be all right. You can go when you're ready." A few minutes later, the woman's breathing, labored and irregular for days before that, softened. She passed 20 minutes later, quietly, without any visible tension. Coincidence or not, no one can prove that with absolute certainty, but the nurse said she had seen this pattern too many times to consider it chance. Now, what to do right now if you're reading this and realizing that someone in your life is going through this, or you're thinking about your own preparation? If you're with someone who is dying, speak out loud, even if it seems they can't hear you. Give specific permission to leave, not general words, but directly. Name what you think the person might be worried about you, about unfinished matters, about someone else, and say plainly that it will be all right. If you're thinking about yourself, start with one specific conversation you've been putting off for years. Not all of them at once, just one. Today, this week. Name out loud at least one of your fears about death, to yourself, in a journal, or to someone close to you, and forgive at least one person, possibly including yourself, for something you've been carrying for too long. Cayce never promised that this work would make death pleasant or spare those left behind from the pain of loss. He spoke of something else, the difference between leaving in a state of inner war and leaving in a state of inner peace. The very difference hospice nurses witness every day, rarely speaking of it out loud, except to those ready to hear it. Write in the comments, is there that one conversation in your life that you keep putting off, that one sentence you never said? Maybe today is the day to finally say it.